Hi, I'm Laura Rogers, and welcome to my session, Mastering Power Apps and SharePoint-Related Lists. Now, the concept of this session, it's going to be a fairly quick session. It's 20 minutes, so I'm going to get right to the point. The concept is that you have two different lists in SharePoint, and you have a parent and a child relationship. Now, the most common scenario where I've seen people use a parent-child relationship is an expense report. So you have the main expense report people are filling out, and then you have all those detail items. And those are the details about each individual expense. So think about the concept of repeating tables that you have, any sort of list of things inside of a form. That is where you're going to need to build this repeating table in a form, which is also known as a parent-child list. And in SharePoint, this starts off with having two different lists. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how you can build this in Power Apps so that you can use these two different SharePoint lists to create this concept of having an interface in a Power App that looks to the end user like they're filling out a simple form, but what they're doing is filling out an expense report that's got a parent, and all of the sub items are writing to a separate list that's the child. So the way this is constructed is, here's a little visual here. We have this parent. So in this case, again, it's the expense report, and we have information about the expense report itself, and it has got the person's name and maybe the date and some basic information that applies to that whole report. And some important information that I need is the ID of that SharePoint item. So for example, the ID might be 42, and I'm also going to be using a variable in Power Apps to be able to refer to that ID that I'm storing in the variable. I'll go ahead and demonstrate this in a minute, but I want to kind of lay out these concepts. So when I have a child list, this is going to be a separate SharePoint list, and this will be the expense items. This is the concept of this subtable. So I have things like category, date, amount, and then the parent ID. So the parent ID is where I'm storing the ID of that parent item, so all these child items will know which expense report they go with. So I have this, it's a lookup column in SharePoint in the child list, and by default, I'm setting a field in this sort of repeating table sub list when people are filling out the expense report. I've got a hidden field that they can't see that is storing the ID of that parent item. So every time someone creates a child item, it's writing to SharePoint, and it's also writing the ID of the parent. So the end user doesn't have to know anything or do anything extra. That ID is just being written to those child items. So another thing that I'm doing is not only, of course, creating those child items as someone fills each row out, is that I'm also displaying those child items. And in this example, you can use a table or a gallery in your Power App, and I'm doing a filter. So I'm filtering the expense items by the parent ID of that specific form that I'm looking at. All right, here are both concepts sort of put together in one. So I have the parent expense report, ID 42. I'm storing it in a variable called var_record. And then I've got the child items, which have all the detail, all the rows. And that child list has that lookup, the parent ID lookup. So here's on the card itself, the card that I'm hiding when someone's filling out that child item form. This is the syntax for how you can set the default value on that card, the default value for that SharePoint lookup field that we're writing to. And this is the syntax for anytime you want to write to a lookup field in SharePoint sort of behind the scenes. All right, now having to do with this concept, I have a pro tip. When I'm creating this child list, not only do I create a lookup to the parent, I also create an extra number field, and I'm going to write that parent ID to the number field also. So I like having the lookup field, Because lookup fields in SharePoint give you this little extra setting that lets you do this cascade delete concept, which means that if I delete the parent, it will automatically delete the children, and I like that. But I also like the ability to have that ID stored in a number column, which makes it easier to filter that list when I'm in a gallery or a table in the Power App. So I just go ahead and I create 2 columns. These are not columns the end user is going to see or interact with, but that's just something that I'm storing in SharePoint. Let's do a demo. Now I'll go ahead and show you an example of a finished product. It's fairly simple. It's not the most beautiful app, but I want to show you all the concepts involved in building this parent-child relationship. So I'll show you what the end result looks like, and then I'll take you through building it. First of all, I'll go ahead and fill out a new expense report. Just gave it a simple name. So these would be the fields that I have that represent the expense report as a whole. So I only put a couple of fields, but you get the idea of the fields that would exist in the parent item. So once I've created, I will need to create this item so that I will have an ID. So I go ahead and I created this sort of next concept so that this item will be submitted so I have an ID. And I'm passing this ID to these fields here. So these 2 fields, parent lookup and parent ID, those are the cards that I'll be hiding before I go into production, but I wanted you to be able to visually see what I'm doing here. So these are the expense details. So I'll give each one a little bit of information. And as you can see, as I'm going through here and adding each one, it adds them to this little sub list. So that is the concept that we're talking about here in this session. So now I have a parent form that's being filled out and these child items. And when I'm finished, I can just go back to the main list where I started. Okay, so now let's go ahead and build that. And I'm going to start with, I'll already have this screen built, and I'll start by just creating a new screen for this whole expense form. So again, it's not going to be the prettiest thing because I'm just going to whip this up very quickly for this demo, but I want to show you all the concepts involved in being able to pass that parameter and filter that child list. So I'll go ahead and create a new screen. And this is going to be my expense form. So I'll go ahead and start by inserting an edit form, and this is my expense parent. So here, these are the SharePoint lists involved here. This is where I have my expense reports. This is the parent list, and then my expense items. This is the child list. So the key here is that in the child list in SharePoint, I've got this parent lookup that is a lookup to that main expense report list. See, it says expense report. And then I also have that extra field that I mentioned, the parent ID, which is a number field. So those are the ones that I'm going to pre-populate when I'm filling in that form. Okay, so this first form is going to be the parent. And I'm just going to narrow it down very quickly just to have a couple of things to fill in. And then I need to have a submit button. And what this is going to do is it will submit this item so that I have an ID for this parent, and then it will light up the other part of the screen where I can add the child items. That gives me the ability to add the child items and be able to populate that parent ID and have the parent ID already exist. So this next button is going to simply do a submit form for whatever the name of this form is, and it's form 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving things nice names for this demo. It's submitting this little quick top level form for the expense parent. And then when I want a form to do something after it's submitted, I go to the forms on success property. So what I'm going to do when this is successful is I'm going to create a variable, and I'm calling it var expense record. And I'm going to tell it to set this variable to this form 2, dot last submit. So I'm setting the variable to whatever I just submitted in this top level form, and then I'm going to do a new form. I'm going to have a new form down here for the child items. So I'll comment that out until I'm ready, and then I'm also going to have a variable that's going to make those other things light up on the screen, the child items and the child form. So that is going to be, I'm calling that variable CTX child pop. I'm setting it to true, and that'll make those appear. Let's go ahead and add the child list here. So I'll go insert a data table, and my data table is going to be my expense items. And I'll move it over here and get rid of a little bit of this. I don't need to have the parent lookup on here or the parent ID. So I've narrowed this down, but also I'm going to be filtering it as well. So I'm going to be filtering it to only show the items related to this parent. I'm also going to add another form control. And in this form control, I'm just going to get rid of a couple of these to make it a little shorter. And then this form control and then this table are going to be the two things that are going to appear. So when they appear, I go to the visible property to set that variable that is a Boolean, so it's true or false. So since visible is a Boolean, then I'm going to either show it or hide it. So visible is just true or false, and so is that variable. Okay, so I'll fill something in, I'll click next, and then it will be submitted, and then those things will appear. Not only do I want them to appear, but now that I actually have my new form that I've added, it's just called Form 3, I'll go ahead and put Form 3 in the new form. So it's setting a variable, filling out a new form, and then making these things appear when I submit this form. Now, I do need to have a button that sends the new form command when I'm filling out a new expense report. So I'll just quickly add a button to the top of this screen that will do a new form. And that is Form 2 is that top level one that I just created. So that's my new form. Okay, so another thing that I need to do is I want this form to show the item that I just submitted, and right now it says no item to display. That's a little ugly. I need this thing to filter down to only show the items for this parent ID. So I'm kind of just adding things as I go, adding logic as I go. So this form, to make it show the item that I just submitted, I go to the item property, and that is my variable that I'm setting. And then this table, I don't want it showing all of those child items from SharePoint. I want it showing just the ones related to this parent. So I'll do filter the expense items where the parent ID equals, and then that's in my variable expense record dot ID. Okay, now I don't have any children yet for this item, and I also haven't set these defaults yet. So this is the thing that I mentioned in the slide where we set the default value of the card. So this card, I need to go unlock it, and then I'm going to take the syntax from the slide and just copy that and put it in the default. And then I just need to change this to be I'm calling my variable var expense record in this case. That is the record of that parent item. So look at that. As soon as I fill it in, it actually says the name of that parent item. And then the parent ID, I also need to go to the default value there. And that is simply var expense record dot ID. Okay, and then it shows the ID. So now I've got this defaulting to the correct values. And then I also want the next button to go away after I've clicked it. So if I want something to be the opposite of a Boolean, I can say I want it to be the opposite of CTX child pop. And then that means it disappears when I click on it. Okay, so let's try this out. I'm filling this in, and obviously look at this. Look what I'm missing. I haven't created a button to click to make it add the record to the subtable. So that's another button that I need. So what I'm going to do is I actually like putting buttons inside of cards so that the button sort of stays with the form. It's just sort of a best practice. So since I'm going to be hiding these two cards, I don't want to put it in those since they won't be showing. So I'll go ahead and add a button in here. I'll just say add detail. And then I have a button when I'm finished with the whole expense report. And I'm going to put that way down at the bottom. Finished. And that actually doesn't necessarily need to do anything. I really just mostly need it to navigate me away because I've already submitted this item and I'm already submitting all the child items. So it could just, I could just do a submit form on both of these just in case. Let me put a new on this. Okay, so I'm adding the detail. I need to make this button do something. So I'm submitting this form. And this form is called Form 3. And then again, I don't like to put things right after the submit form function. If I want something to happen after a submit a form, I usually like to do that in the on success of the form. So what do I want to happen here? So on success, I'll do a new form of this same form so that I can just keep adding those child items. When I click the new button, I want all of this to sort of reset. So not only do I want to do a new form, but what if I want to start all over? I want to do a new form. I want to set my CTX child pop to false. And let's go ahead and try that out. Now it's cleared out. I'll call this test 353. Okay, now I haven't added any child items yet. I also didn't clear this form out. Before I update context, I'll go ahead and reset Form 3 just in case. That child form. And let's try that out. Okay, it clears it out. And I noticed one thing as I was doing that is that my finish button needs to also have that context variable set on it so that it doesn't appear yet on that screen. So now I can add all my child items, and as I add them they appear here, and when I'm finished it will take me to another screen. So the last couple of things you would do to clean up would be to change the visible property to false on these two cards that you don't need to see. You can't delete them because they do need to be there, but you change the visible to false. That way you can still pass that information to them, and they will know that data about that parent form. And I'll go ahead and go to the visible property and change that to the CTX child pop so that it doesn't appear until I'm filling out this last section of the form. All right, so recap, back to this last slide. We have the parent item. The ID of that parent item is important, so we're setting it in a variable as soon as that parent form is submitted. When the parent form is submitted, then we're lighting up the screen to add the children, which is just my method of making sure that we have an ID for the parent before we start filling in the child items. And then as we fill in each child item, we're passing the ID of that parent to them. And then just, hiding and showing things. You saw that I created a variable. You saw that we made it a nice smooth interface so that it makes it easy for the end user to understand what they're doing next and which button they are expected to be clicking. Thanks for watching my session. Check out my training site at iwmentor.com. This has just been an excerpt from my Power Apps Advanced class, which is about 13 hours long. I have a lot of different Power Apps, Power Automate, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, online self-paced training, and I even have some live online classes. So check out my site. Thanks.